Hey guys, my name is Michael Leslie. I am doing my presentation on The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. I'll start off with a quote from the end of the book. Lewis states that you cannot go on explaining away forever, for you will find that you have explained explanation itself away. In 1943, C.S. Lewis gave a series of lectures at Oxford that were later recorded and published in a book entitled The Abolition of Man. Lewis gives an explanation of the importance of cultural and universal values to his audience and readers that live in a society where values are not, where values as such are not as appreciated as they once were. As Lewis pursues further and further into his in-depth and scholarly lectures, the readers are forced to either make a choice of absolute values based on morals or throw away values altogether. The Abolition of Man is arguably the most debated work in his entire anthology. It is a timeless piece of writing that will perhaps be forever relevant to society. Lewis starts the lecture series with a lecture entitled Men Without Chests. In this lecture, Lewis tells the readers about two authors who co-wrote a children's book that Lewis gives the alias of the Green Book. Lewis complains how the authors Gaius and Titius use words that provoke emotion onto an unwilling child without the child even knowing what is happening to them. Lewis goes on later in the lecture to explain why the authors were wrong in their doing, even though they may not have known what was going on. Lewis quotes St. Augustine by stating that he defines virtue as ordo amoris, which is the ordinate condition of the affections, in which every object is accorded that degree of love which is appropriate. In other words, Lewis is reiterating the fact that we only give as much love to something as we feel it is worthy of. Lewis discusses the concept of true and false emotions and how Gaius and Titius, his students, are not being shown the right way to feel about an emotion, about something from reading their book, due to the words that Gaius and Titius use in the book, words such as sublime and only. Lewis ends the chapter, or in the lecture, with the idea that the heart, or the middle chest element, is what determines and what makes a man a man. If you take out the very thing that creates the natural emotions, then you simply all you have left is a man without a chest. In the second lecture, which is entitled The Way, Lewis uses the Taiyou, or the Chinese word for moral ethics. Throughout this lecture, he uses the Taiyou as a reference point or standard for society and for Gaius and Titius. He states that the authors of the Green Book are using some other set of values that are not subjective at all. Lewis debunks the idea of using instinct over ethics by saying that even just like people say different things, so do instincts. Instincts at their best disregard all other options, solely relying on the person to listen only to that instinct. Lewis uses sentiment value as not merely subjective, but as always being of sentimental value. He states that just as a poet can change his works, he states that just as a poet that changes his works is working from within, so are people's emotions when they feel a certain way. All the change comes from within via suffering or joy. Lewis uses the Taiyou as a standard of moral living. From within the Taiyou comes the only authority to modify the Taiyou. This is from page 47 in the book. This simply states that anything trying to change the Taiyou or moral values always comes back rooted to the Taiyou in some sort of way. The only way to change the Taiyou would be for the Taiyou to change the Taiyou. There's absolute truth within the Taiyou. There is no new creation, just the imagination that comes from the creation. Going on to the third lecture, which is the final conclusion of the lecture series, he calls the Abolition of Man. Lewis discusses the force of natural impulses and man's power over nature, turning out to be a power exercised by some men over other men, with nature as its instrument. Lewis describes people that he calls conditioners. They're in control. That they control the greater emotions and values of society. He says that human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man, and how the power of man to make himself what he pleases means that the power of some men to make other men do what they please. Hence the conditioners. Lewis states that it is the conditioner's job to control, not to obey, and within them doing this shows that human nature has thus been conquered. Within them doing this, the daring statement that man's final conquest has been proved to be the abolition of man. That's Lewis's. Lewis gives the daring statement that man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. Stating this, Lewis is reiterating that man is trying to conquer nature, that it has actually stopped man. By doing this, man has reduced things to mere nature. Lewis ends the lecture with a simple thought of a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. By saying this, Lewis is telling his audience and readers that trying to conquer nature will result in a lack of life. A little backstory on Lewis. He was born in Belfast in the United Kingdom on November 29th, 1898. To a loving mother and father. Sadly, Lewis's mother, Florence Augusta Lewis, passed when he was only the young age of 9. His father, Albert, died 20 years later. In 1917, C.S. Lewis, or Clive Staples Lewis, enlisted in the British Army but was wounded and discharged just a little over 1 year later. In 1925, Lewis became a tutor at Oxford and stayed at Oxford until 1954, where he took a position at Cambridge as chairman of medieval and Renaissance literature. Lewis first started publishing works in 1919 under the pseudonym or alias of Clive Hamilton. After his father passed away, Lewis found Jesus. In 1950, Lewis began to publish perhaps his most famous of all of his works, the Chronicles of Narnia. With this series, Lewis was able to usher in the gospel message sort of under the radar, without people knowing that they were hearing the story of Jesus. Although the Chronicles of Narnia are classified as a children's book, they are loved throughout all ages. April 23rd, 1956 was the happiest day of Lewis's life. He got to marry Joy Gresham, which was the love of his life. Clive and Joy were only married for a very short 4 years before Joy passed away. At this point, many scholars state that Lewis started his decline in health and life in general. After his wife passed away, he published his work, A Grief Observed, that is about losing a loved one. Shortly after his wife died, Lewis himself passed away on November 22nd, 1963. Some believed it was from kidney inflammation problems that he had developed after his wife's death, while others believe it was from a broken heart. Many of Lewis's arguments in the Abolition of Man that some believe are the most debatable are the arguments that seem to offend the mind. When Lewis discusses that Gaius and Titius use words that somewhat provoke emotion in people, that makes the reader almost feel like Lewis is slandering the authors, when in all actuality, Lewis makes the point that many people do not think about. If someone was to say, this lemonade is exquisite, that is provoking the person that wants to try the lemonade to automatically think that the lemonade is going to be exquisite before tasting it. This can sometimes seem unclear, but only if one does not understand the concept of making choices for themselves, whether that be thinking or feeling for themselves. Lewis also discusses the Tayo and how he uses that as a standard for right moral living. Lewis, throughout his second lecture, talks about individuals trying to derive stuff from outside the Tayo, which is contradictory to creation itself. Like I said earlier, one cannot create something new. It can only alter the creation. The new creation does not exist, only imagination. To state a truth, one has to take from the original Tayo and simply put their own twist on it. Lewis helps the audience and readers understand that in order to have values, one has to have a standard. One has to first have a standard. Lecture 3 of the series, The Abolition of Man, was perhaps the most confusing for some readers. Lewis brings up human nature and the power of man. He also states that human nature has been conquered, thus the abolition of man happening. Therefore, there is essentially no further point of living after man has been stopped. Trying to explain things in so much depth eventually takes away from the meaning of the initial thought in the first place. Thus, the quote from the very beginning. I don't know, I'll go back up and read it. That you cannot go on explaining away forever, for you will find that you have explained explanation itself away. The Abolition of Man is a book that cannot be rushed through. I tried it. It's a short 81 pages, but it took me about 6 days to read it. C.S. Lewis presented these lectures with the intent of doing the exact thing that he talked against in the book, provoking the mind. Although Lewis most likely knew what he was doing while presenting these lectures, it just goes to show the power that man has over their own kind. Perhaps Lewis was very much type of conditioner in this book. Perhaps Lewis was very much a type of conditioner in this book himself while persuading his audience to sway in a certain direction. Or perhaps Lewis was actually deriving from the Tayo and using a sort of double entendre of sorts to show the true hearts of the audience and of himself. Or perhaps Lewis may have been trying to explain something almost to the point of explaining the point away. Or maybe Lewis is just lecturing in order to see these things through. Sadly, this book is somewhat left with many unanswered questions from the audience, and that is why The Abolition of Man is still to this day one of Lewis's greatest and most debated works. Thank you for your time.